Good morning again, one and all. I'd like to welcome you to Vanderbilt Divinity School. My name is Emily Towns. I'm the dean of the school. And it's my great honor to be able to introduce one of my colleagues. One of the great things about community meal or community breakfast for me is that I get to shamelessly brag on the people I work with every day. So it is indeed a great honor to introduce Professor Paul C.H. Lim, who is Associate Professor of the History of Christianity, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of History. Paul began his career with us in 2006, and I think one of the highest accolades any teacher can have is when your students say this about you. Dr. Lim is very passionate about his subject matter and clearly wants all of his students to be engaged and successful. He has produced 2 solo manuscripts and 1 co-edited manuscript. The first, In Pursuit of Purity, Unity, and Liberty, Richard Baxter's Puritan Ecclesiology in its 17th century context, is a well-researched and documented study of Baxter's attempt to maintain the unity of the Church of England while trying to also reform it. Some of us know that is not an easy 2-step. His second book, Mystery Unveiled, The Crisis of the Trinity in Early Modern England, was selected by the 16th Century Society and Conference as the 2013 Roland H. Bainton Prize winner for the best book in history theology. His 2 current book projects, demonstrate his widening interest because from the first 2 you would wonder, how do we get to global evangelicalism from 17th century England? I will tell you. One of the projects, Bondage and Freedom, Reformation Theologies in Historical Contexts, continues his arc within 17th century England. But his topic this morning is the topic of his other book he's working on at the same time, Global Evangelicalism and the Campaign Against Human Trafficking, Fad or Fixture. And this will be addressed in depth in his second book project. Paul is a fine scholar, a fine colleague, a fine citizen of the university and the city, and a pretty fine human being all around. So it's my great honor to welcome him to the podium this morning.
Good morning. It's a great Good morning. It's a great honor to be here. I realized that I did this breakfast 6.5 years ago. It was a breakfast called Preaching Against Pharaoh, Liberation Theology from the Puritan Revolution to Jeremiah Wright. And after that talk, I got a letter from Reverend Jeremiah Wright thanking me for the talk that I gave, because apparently some of the students from this event went to the Proctor conference and told Dr. Wright about this breakfast talk that happened. So certainly, so that really kind of stuck in my memory, individual and institutional memory, as something that I really enjoyed very much. And today I have the second honor of talking about another very deep personal and scholarly interest of mine, the 2 strands of global evangelicalism and human trafficking. So let's, as Dean Towns asked the question, how did he get there? So how did I get from 17th century London to 21st century Calcutta? So I'll call it my journey toward meaning. You know, I did my PhD at Cambridge in 2001, and I was trained as a historian who looked at a lot of manuscripts and archival materials and texts that not a lot of people read these days, and they're not going to be on Kindle. But that was my academic training, and then worked toward you know, my other scholarly projects. But one of the things that I began to do in my last institution as well as here is to go and teach overseas. But I should actually say that teach and learn overseas, because what morsel of wisdom or insights I can impart to the friends and students I had overseas, I learned so much more about self and Savior and society from them. So, but these are some of the countries, so Ethiopia, Tanzania, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Vietnam, China, Japan, and India, Poland, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the things that would happen, well, one of the kind of recurring patterns of my sociality was to go teach there and learn from the people there, and to attend services, and to meet a lot of Christian NGO workers and so on and so forth, or missionaries. And a lot of them, their narratives went something like this. I came here as church planner. I came and realized that there are other needs that are much more pressing, so I became far more interested in and switched over to global advocacy work. So it could mean kind of humanitarian aid, but also I began to notice in the last 15 years of my journey of teaching and learning overseas that there is a kind of a much more intensification of efforts to eradicate human trafficking among evangelical Christians. So it wasn't just an academic interest, it wasn't just a sociological observation. I began to realize, yes, I think it's something that I also should do something about, but it wasn't clear to me as to when and how. And so about 4 years ago now, I was tenured as and promoted to associate professor. And in one of my delightful conversations with Dean Towns, I asked her about my blossoming interests and how do I connect the two. And she simply encouraged, you should write about this. You should write a book. And even though the two 17th century London and 21st century Calcutta, DC, and Seoul may not be seemingly related, but the connective tissue is you yourself. So that's how I kind of came around to it. But one of the most kind of, if I can singularize an event that really kind of changed my perspective on this, is one night in Colombo, Sri Lanka in 2004. I was teaching there and again learning a lot about a number of different things, and the teaching, it was actually a continuing education for pastors. Soon, the summer after the tsunami had hit. So we were kind of roughing it in student dorms for 2 weeks, and then the last evening of our stay in Sri Lanka, the organizer said, you've done a lot of work, and why don't you just, we got you and your colleague a nice hotel room, and it's one of those 4 or 5-star hotels in Colombo, and then we'll, see you off the next morning. I didn't think much about it. I mean, it was a nice hotel for sure, and then I go upstairs to my room, and my colleague went to his room, and I get a call from, and for the sake of what is about to follow, I'm not going to tell you the hotel's name. I get a call from the concierge asking me if everything's okay. And I said, yeah, everything's fine. And he asked me, would you like a drink, a beer perhaps? I said, no, I'm actually kind of rather tired, and I have some water here, so it'll be fine. And there about 2 seconds of hesitation. He says, would you like some whiskey? I said, no, I'm fine, I don't need any whiskey. And then another few seconds of hesitation, and the gentleman asked, would you like a woman? I said, no, I'm okay, I'm not interested in a woman right now. And several seconds, a young girl said, no, I'm not interested in a young girl. A boy said, no, I'm not interested in a boy. And I said, sir, it's very, very kind of you to offer me beer, wine, woman, girl, and boy. Actually, what I'm really looking for is some nice rest. And I hung up the phone. But then something like that had never happened to me before, and I found myself actually like shivering, and I don't know what that reaction was, but you can probably guess what I mean. And that led me downstairs. I went downstairs and wanted to talk to the gentleman who, in his, I guess, and what he will say is this. He said, and I go downstairs and he says, "Oh, you're here. Do you need something now?" I said, "No, I'm not in need of anything." But I guess I was much younger, 11 years ago. I said, "Do you know why I'm here in your country?" And he said, "No, I have no idea why. What are you doing in our country?" I said, "Well, I'm actually here to help." Christian pastors, so they're already minority population, but to get more encouraged and so on and so forth. He goes, "Oh, I see." And he said, and he said, "Sir, I was actually trying to do you a favor, because people with your passports, when they come here, what else do you think they're after here in Sri Lanka?" Now, mind you, Sri Lanka is not one of the hot spots of human trafficking. However, that is determined by the U.S. State Department or International Justice Mission or so on and so forth. But that event really kind of shook me up. And then I went upstairs and got some sleep, maybe about 2-3 hours, but that really kind of stayed with me as to like, okay, I need to actually, I'm usually looked upon as the sort of person who would be doing this with my looks and with my passport, so what do I do? So that's all of that to say that my scholarly interest in training and then my personal perspectives and pursuits have sort of kind of coalesced in a very unplanned way. It wasn't something like, okay, after I get tenure, I'm going to do this. So, but these are some of the statistics, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on stats. I'll just leave them up there for a few. But you know, slavery exists today. Slavery exists in a very real form today. If you think that human trafficking is something that happens in the streets and slums of Calcutta or streets of Albania, no, we're mistaken. It happens right here in Nashville as well. It's not just in New York, it's not just in Vegas, it's not just in New Orleans, it happens in Green Hills, Nashville, Tennessee as well. And you probably have seen reports about that. And before I get in any further depth, I want to acknowledge and appreciate the presence of some of the global advocates who are involved in these kind of endeavors as part of your own calling and profession. So as a bumbling academic, my role is to somehow do justice to the complexities of what is going on here with 27 million slaves, and that stats is probably several years old. It probably has gone up. And these are some staggering numbers and real presences that really kind of cause us to raise the question, what am I to do? I mean, I think one of the most intense kind of internal conversations I'm having, especially as I find myself in the sort of red light districts in Seoul, Korea, or Calcutta, India, and so on. Like, is it okay for me to just write about this, right? Is that my calling, just to be a scholar who writes about these problems? Shouldn't I actually kind of, and there have been a couple of occasions where I thought like, maybe I should just leave my job as a professor and do this as part of my own kind of renewed calling. And then I thought better, not better of myself, but just then I thought, okay, no, I think there still is a room for people who are involved in the scholarly endeavors of making better sense of and providing a much more richly contextualized narratives about what is going on. So, and so these are all the stats that are there, and I'll come back to it later on. It is a huge, huge money-generating, revenue-generating industry. So when you think of the word trafficking, 15 years ago, we would associate the word trafficking and put the word drug before it, right? You know what I'm saying, right? Drug trafficking. It's now almost kind of coterminous with human trafficking, and human trafficking apparently is much easier to be done because you can smuggle a person, whether a young girl, young boy, a grown-up man or woman, and with their kind of particular tactics and so on, they look like a regular person, whereas smuggling of drugs and trafficking of drugs is far more challenging in many ways. So all of these things are there, and but I do want to kind of get involved in our kind of media part of the conversation, or sort of a narrative, and that starts with Nick Kristof. Nick Kristof is a very well-known New York Times journalist who is an activist and especially with regard to women's rights globally. And he has written this very interesting piece in July 2011. It says, in these polarized times, few words conjure as much distaste in liberal circles as evangelical Christians. Yet go to the front lines at home or abroad in the battles against human trafficking or genocide. Some of the bravest people you meet are evangelical Christians or Catholics who truly live their faith. And I think this is a very, very important kind of statement for me. I think it's just thinking about, okay, why do evangelicals have this reputation? And how come there's this thing about evangelical commitment to eradicate human trafficking and human rights? And I think these are very, very interesting things. So to me, there's an interesting historical irony, if not seeming oddity, about evangelicals assuming the lead role in the global crusade against human rights violations, especially trafficking of human persons for labor exploitations and sexual slavery. In fact, it is almost a historical truism to say conservative evangelical Christians in the US were nearly invisible while Dr. King and others were leading civil rights marches and demonstrations in Selma, DC, and beyond in the 1960s. Nevertheless, half a century later, we have the aforementioned quote by Nick Kristof. So what really happened? Or how do we situate this recent, let's say in the last 3 decades, trend among global evangelicals to be in the trenches of fighting against this nearly ubiquitous pandemic? This talk will offer a sort of a quick transnational study. I mean, we have until 8:30, so I'm going to spend 5 minutes in Korea, 5 minutes in India, and 5 minutes in the US. And I'm not doing any justice to them, but I can only say that when the book comes out, please read it, because it'll offer much more textured narratives about all of these three. And so I'll just give you a little bit of kind of appetizer here. So is the global evangelicals community is represented at least partially by India, South Korea, and the US. Their fight against human trafficking that raises fundamental questions about how these evangelical Christians understand the implications of the gospel and participate in their restoration of shalom, peace of God project. By doing so, it does justice to the fact that the concerns of the global church do not exist as a separate or indeed separable compartment from the life of American churches. Furthermore, this will not merely be about American evangelical activism in South Korea or India or other nations deemed to be hotspots for human trafficking. Instead, it'll highlight the issues of neo-colonial tensions within the work of evangelical missions, as well as the manifold endeavors carried out by indigenous Christian leaders in Korea and India, often in partnership with evangelical NGOs and mission organizations from the US, but also with some substantial disagreements about power sharing and deep misgivings about what I would call American evangelical exceptionalism. Furthermore, we'll briefly look at the role played by a number of Latin American and South Asian leaders at the first Lausanne Conference for World Evangelization in 1974, and much beyond in setting aflame a number of majority Anglo-American evangelical leaders for global awareness of poverty, structural sin, thus renewed desire for social engagement. And in doing so, we will complicate the narrative of American evangelicalism as a phenomenon which was relatively homegrown, with most of its theological and social visions coming from within. So let's take a trip to Korea. I entered the sanctuary, cavernous sanctuary, with a theater-style seating and a rock and roll music with the words, "Yes, Lord," repeating about 8 times. I found myself eagerly anticipating an epiphany of some sort. This is an English ministry of one of the largest churches in South Korea, indeed of the world. Their membership is around 80,000 people, and for this English-speaking ministry, they have about 3,000 members, located in the south of Han River. The lead pastor, Dr. Eddie Byun, has been on CNN.com talking about his lifelong passion. His book, Justice Awakening, has been endorsed by a number of evangelical leaders globally, including Gary Haugen, the fiery and intrepid founder of International Justice Mission, or simply known as IJM. There's been some major transformation in the way Onnuri, this church's English ministry, has done its ministry. As I've done some mid-range longitudinal congregational study of the sermons and their outreach activities from 2002 to about now, it is quite remarkable to witness something of that shift. For Dr. Byun, the core DNA of the church's mission and ministry is eradication of human trafficking. He uses that term interchangeably with sex trafficking. And since that, more than anything else, tugs away at the heart of God, seeing so many vulnerable, young, helpless victims, God moves to action, he says, calling and utilizing human agents who are designed to restore and redeem the shalom of God. Even though this church's entire liturgy and church staff has been reoriented to think of this top priority for all that they do and all that they are. In my interviews with him, Byun shared that he's definitely not alone in this. For him, the healthy awakening of evangelical churches spread globally toward active support of and partnership with a number of NGOs, nonprofits, and otherwise ministries that are designed to eradicate human suffering and human trafficking is a really the sign that God is at work. Predictably, perhaps, there has been some polar opposite responses to this tectonic shift. If the church's mission, the singular mission, is eradication of human trafficking, let's say someone were to tell you that all that we do as a church is just to eradicate this, and it's a serious global pandemic, as I shared. Some have joined this Onnuri Church's English ministry precisely because of its preponderant emphasis on human trafficking and the eradication thereof, whereas others have left the church for the very same reason, criticizing its allegedly tragic departure from the root of the gospel. I will go meet with Dr. Byun next summer again, and he and I are on fairly regular contact as I'm doing this ethnographic study, not only of him, but also of staff and the parishioners, because recently he was asked to step down. And the official reason was something else, but the unofficial reason, one of them, I think, had to do with the sort of divergence of vision regarding the church and the church's mission. The Korean-speaking ministry staff felt that, yes, it is important to be engaged socially, but eradication of human trafficking should not be the only thing we should care about. So it was a very, very interesting kind of chapter, and this chapter is called The Strange Case of Dr. Eddie Byun, and trying to kind of chronicle both the Korean and the diasporic kind of Christianity's kind of contestation about what is at the root of the gospel. So what this Korean megachurch's English-speaking ministry's metamorphosis illustrates for me is the complexity of global evangelicalism and the diasporic reimagining of true religion and spirituality. More on that later. Let's move to Calcutta, India, and then we'll somehow weave them together. I spent about 2 weeks during July 2014 there interviewing a number of anti-human trafficking missions and NGOs, as well as in Delhi, India, as well as a new and long overdue part of this war on neo-slavery on a global scale. I was visiting a garment factory that exclusively hires women and young girls who were former victims of sex trafficking. The factory is situated in about 2 blocks away from one of the major brothels or red light districts of Calcutta. It was a 4-story converted villa, and there were nearly 100 women busily working to meet deadlines set by their bosses for items to be sold in Europe, the US, Canada, and maybe Japan or Hong Kong. They were printing t-shirts, sewing on straps to tote bags, and beating the dye into the cloth that will be used for various kinds of clothing. I've given this talk a number of times, and every time I talk about this, mention this paragraph, the images are shot right across my own kind of head about what they were doing and the encounters that I've had there. I walked over to another BAM, B-A-M, that's what they're called, Business as Mission. I will have more to say about the genesis of these new instantiations of evangelical mission, but for now, let's go to this other smaller outfit that produced handmade stationery goods, note cards, notepads, pencil cases, and recycled saris turned into colorful scarves. And going back to this larger garment factory, their day was punctuated by 2 tea breaks, lunch, and a 30-minute chapel or devotional time in which they sang a couple of Western Christian songs, and a New Zealander spiritual director with tattoos all over his arms and neck gave a stirring talk on God being the source of our daily strength. The 3 most unforgettable scenes for me on that day of visit are as follows. 1, the absolutely expressionless faces of the women singing or listening to the huffing and puffing of this 20-something hipster preacher. 2, the blank stare that the finance director drew when I asked about profit-sharing model beyond the factotum wage the workers were drawing. To give you a concrete instance, I bought 10 scarves for $300. I think that happens quite a lot with, people from the first world going there and just confronted with the stark reality of the, even for them, relatively abject conditions at work. They're rescued from their own kind of former life as sex slaves. And $300, why $300? That's all the cash I had. So impulsively, I bought these 10 scarves for $300. I don't think I'm 99% sure it doesn't cost $30 per scarf to produce them. And then I kind of thought about, okay, maybe it costs maybe 1/10 of that, and then if you do the math, the profit margins become staggeringly high. So they're raising the inexorable question, cui bono, who really benefits? So I asked them, do you have any profit sharing model? I mean, how much do they get paid? Well, basically a little bit over Indian minimum wage. Okay, well, so if you make more money, do they have do they have stock options and something like that, profit sharing? And they said, no, we don't, and we'll just pay them whatever that they need to get paid. Now, I'm not criticizing that as such, but it raised some questions because these evangelical BAMs, businesses, missions, are precisely about improving the workers' conditions and doing better than the secular counterparts. And one of the, I think, business models in a lot of these emerging businesses to really give the worker a sense of deep dignity, both in terms of ontology, but also economy. And so I kind of noted that as a very interesting thing. Who really benefits? Third kind of memorable scene for me is the mixed emotion with which the former medical doctor turned local Indian fighter for justice for the Dalit women, victims of sex trafficking, when I asked her honest opinions about Western missionaries. She said, some of the most wonderful and the best people I've ever met of representatives of humanity are Western missionaries. But at the same time, The opposite end of the spectrum are also some of the Western missionaries. And that really kind of came unexpectedly. She said that, they really, some of the most Jesus-like people in the world are some of these missionaries. But at the same time, I'm saddened to say that there are some other types that are like that. And then we got into a conversation about this whole issues of kind of neo-colonialism, and especially for Indian context, colonialism and colonial experience is something that is very fresh in their mind. So are some people using religion as a hook for that? I don't know. And these are certainly, and she is certainly balanced. She says, no, some are really not doing that, but then some come in and without that much desire to understand the local context and who are some of the local fighters for justice and things of that sort. But I think that is also changing a good deal. Closer to home in the US and also at Vanderbilt. So another example this time from within the US takes us to an Atlanta-based evangelical college and young adult targeted gathering called Passion Conference, led by a charismatic movement leader, as they prefer to be called rather than pastor, named Louis Giglio. In January 2012, among the 42,000 gathered in a 3-day conference held in Georgia Dome, they raised further awareness of and rallied financial support for fight against sex trafficking. Powerful videos of former victims, freedom fighters, and impassioned plea by speakers led to a total fundraising result of $1.2 million for organizations such as International Justice Mission and others. Giglio and his colleagues, their coordinated efforts did not go unheeded. The influential progressive Christian magazine Sojourners praised their efforts for taking up the cause for the most vulnerable and the most erasable group of individuals, globally speaking. Shortly after the conference at the National Prayer Breakfast, President Obama praised the work of these evangelical freedom fighters by saying that, quote, it was inspiring to see thousands of young Christians filling Georgia Dome at the Passion Conference to worship the God who sets the captives free and work to end modern-day slavery, end quote. So here are the 3 vignettes: Korea, India, and the United States of America. And for the rest of the paper, I want to ask some historical questions, but because of time, and I do want to engage in a Q&A, I will skip that historical part that had to do with the Latin American and South Asian participation at the Lausanne World Congress for Evangelization. I'll be happy to talk after the breakfast about it. But I want to take us back to Vanderbilt, because last fall there was an event at Vanderbilt in November, a summit on human trafficking with 100 of leading spokespersons, activists, and students participating on a Sunday afternoon. I don't know if some of you are there, but I was the faculty sponsor for that and worked a lot with the students. And speakers ranged from the provost of Vanderbilt to an FBI agent with special assignments in an anti-sex trafficking unit, former missionary agents whose ministry has gone from that of traditional church planting to an all-out endeavors on anti-sex trafficking, with aftercare homes both here in the U.S., also in Thailand, and the director for college mobilization for IJM. It was, as far as first-time events go, a smashing success. Recently, I sat down with 2 of the key organizers of this event to listen to their story. It was not so recent, it was almost 10 months ago, as to why they care so much about this. So one of the ways that I'm conducting this study is ethnographic study. So whereas my native training is 17th century England, I cannot go back and talk to these people, right? Unless I don't have the gift of medium or, kind of channeling people back into them. That's not my spiritual gift at all. So I can't do that. Whereas with this particular inquiry, I can actually talk to people. And I think they're both kind of pluses and minuses of these ethnographic modalities of study, because whereas I think when you're studying people of the 17th century, you feel you have more under control. You're reading a text. It's a relatively inert text. You read it and you take notes and whatever. You can even print it on Igbo and early English books online and so on. But with this one, the control is much more out the window, because I don't know what they will say. As I shared, there are a lot of elements of surprise about this. So, but I think also a very delightful part is precisely that elements of surprise. So anyway, I was talking to these 2 student leaders, and for their own identity, I'll call them Zach and Hattie. Initially, I must confess I wasn't sure what to expect or the level of sophistication and substance of their answers, but after the interview was completed, I thought I had to include this interview as part of my chapter on American Evangelical Crusade Against Human Trafficking, because this interview, more than any other sources, encapsulates the source and story of the millennial Christians in their pursuit of authenticity, meaning, God, and ultimately self. As Christian Smith has recently noted in his Souls in Transition, the religious and spiritual lives of emerging adults, while today's emerging adults might be at least equally, if not more, interested in religion, so often it is within the context of non-denominational potpourri of religiosity, as they're often called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. Both Zach and Hattie are uncomfortable with labels, and although they have both been affiliated with evangelical churches, they go to some of these kind of mega churches in town, they particularly do not like that label of evangelical because of what it has come to mean in the popular cultural imagination. They said in jest that their views are always in a state of flux and formation. Hattie said that I should talk to her in 2 weeks, for by then her views on a whole array of things might have changed. For Hattie, it is her racial identity of growing up biracial that taught her that, and also fueled her desire to get involved in what she would call kicking the door down on injustice, wherever they are found, but in partnership with regard to sex trafficking. For Hattie, it came about when she was writing her high school paper on global human rights issue, and a growing and inescapable realization came to her that the history that she had been taught, particularly about the U.S., had been so conveniently whitewashed. She was angry for having been duped into believing that the past was so wonderful. That got her thinking about evangelical history, and more than just studying history, she said, I'm going to make history on my own. For Zach, growing up as a missionary kid in Vienna, Austria, surrounded by a number of women who were always eating meals at his parents' house, was how his story begins. When he was much younger, he had no idea why these women were in his home. And when his mother began a halfway house for the recently rescued sex workers in Vienna, Austria, he began to finally grapple with the enormity of this machinery of human enslavement. While he's aware of the fact that there are other women who freely choose this career path of sex work as a mode of feminist liberation and empowerment for women. And in my book, I talk a lot more about that very interesting kind of question for a lot of conservative evangelicals. Commitment to eradicate human trafficking basically looks at prostitution or sex work in toto, totally as unacceptable. And what a lot of the more radical feminists kind of see, sex work as a dignified human profession. And so that's some of the more underlying politics of sexuality that get into it. But you probably aren't that interested in that right now, but I just want to share that and put it out there, because I think so the narrative gets really, really complex. How do we look at sex work, right? Is it the total package? Should it be just say, that's unacceptable? What about the fact that, Abraham Kuyper, one of the Dutch Calvinist theologians, had something to do with, a lot of things such as drug use for any particular state, or legalizing sex work. And so it raises some questions for the Christian community as to what the nature of this profession is. Is it purely and unadulteratedly plundering of the human dignity, or is there something else as well? So, apologies for that aside. Zach is committed to the cause of anti-human trafficking work as his career path, and so is Hattie, in some realm of victim advocacy. For both of them, the work of IJM and the leader of the new monastic movement named Shane Claiborne provide the inspiring North Star. They both seem to differ in terms of where evangelism might come into play. For Hattie, rescuing the victims and restoring their sense of dignity, which in Christian theological term is the imago Dei, the image of God in every human person, irrespective of gender, class, race, sexual orientation, that is the gospel, according to her. Simply put, rescue them and restore them. You don't need to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's no further need for Bible study, evangelistic talks, or sinner's prayer. However, Zach, who is in one of Hattie's closest friend circles, isn't so sure. Perhaps it is attributable to his formative experience of being in a very loving and open-minded missionary home in Austria, but he seems quite open to the idea of the necessary place of evangelism, namely sharing the gospel by introducing you to Jesus, and so on and so forth, as very integral part of evangelical spirituality globally, as an inseparable yet distinct part of rescuing the sex trafficking victims. That reminds me of another millennial Christian who does not appreciate labels that often serve as restrictive entities than generative placeholder. Let's call him Brian. He's a Kiwi, New Zealander, born and raised there, and he took his first degree at Oxford University in PPE, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, with particular attention on global economic development. He experienced conversion to Christianity while at Oxford, and then pursued a slightly different trajectory in terms of career. Rather than go to London and work for a hedge fund or consultancy, neither which he begrudges at all, by the way, he chose to work for IJM. After a few years of field work in India, he switched to another NGO called Justice Ventures International. In my conversation with Brian in Delhi, India, we got around to talking about the meaningful yet provisional work he's engaged with in terms of rescuing workers who are in bonded labor. So bonded labor is another big category for human trafficking, not just in sex trafficking. When asked as to what he regards as the end goal of his work, and this is in a cafe in Delhi, and it's one of those kind of more poignant moments, he unhesitatingly talked about sharing the love of God and seeing that manifest itself in their new knowledge of and relationship with Christ. In other words, Brian still privileges conversion to Christianity as the ultimate goal of all human endeavors, anti-human trafficking work, or whatever else. That then leads me to my final point of this triad, which one is two parts actually. So that is the changing topography of evangelicalism globally and locally. So how is this recent push toward making anti-human trafficking efforts change evangelicalism? I think among others, it got much more kind of attention from the national media with President Bush and President Obama together. I mean, in sequence, both committed to this global anti-human trafficking efforts, and not at the periphery, but at the relative core of this leadership have been a number of evangelical Christians. There's a book by a very fine political scientist at Wheaton College, Mark Amstutz. It's called American Foreign Policy and Evangelicals, and kind of highlighting a lot of evangelical MK's missionary kids, disproportionate number that got involved with kind of State Department or kind of diplomacy, and how that might have had played a role. But among other things, it revealed a hairline fracture in the way Christians today view the role, nature, and extent of evangelism. To recapture what we've been talking about very quickly, one, is it sufficient merely to do acts of mercy, justice, and kindness via anti-human trafficking work and not share the gospel, defined in a more traditional sense? Or, number two, does the anti-human trafficking agent always have to remember herself that the ultimate goal is the restored relationship with God, which is simply impossible without listening to and agreeing to become a Christian? And these two are kind of contestable questions, I recognize. If I've shown anything this morning, it seems that there is a healthy dissonance even among those who broadly define themselves as evangelicals. From the very beginning of the evangelical movements in the 16th century Europe, or maybe even 1st century Jerusalem, there was discord in Zion, or at least en route to Zion. And as far as evangelical eschatology is concerned, they're still on their way, en route indeed, journeying toward the joy and the glory of their triune God. Thank you very much. So I think for my own sake, I would love some feedback and questions. I know the paper was about 30 pages long, it's now 12 pages, and I only gave you about 8. So there's a lot that's left. If you want to get a copy of this paper, I'll be happy to share. It's part of a book it's much like a zip file of a book that I'm working on right now. So love to hear your pushbacks. I've given these versions of this talk in about 9-10 different contexts. And I actually really like people saying, have you considered this other thing? I don't know if I agree with you, because that actually helps me, because if I surround myself with people who agree with me all the time, that doesn't do me much good. So I'll leave it right open. Yes?
Thanks so much for the talk, Paul. I was curious if you've observed any variation or difference in response between the global evangelicals and the even larger, and it's self-perceived as a different stream of Christianity, charismatic Pentecostal movement around the global South.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, so I usually look at what I would call EMPs, evangelicals and Pentecostals, usually kind of together, because in terms of scholarly kind of finessing, there are differences in terms of narratives and historical context, but I think in their present involvement with, and because the Pentecostal Christians are also wondering about the same thing, even in some more intense fashion. But I think in my ethnographic studies so far, I usually interview evangelical Christians and Pentecostals almost indiscriminately. I think they kind of look at them, and I usually ask them, is that okay if I were to call you and bracket you in this kind of, they're like, yeah, fine. So, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to ask you, or maybe give you something to think about, or maybe it's already there, but it
Yes.
didn't make it into the. This distinction about evangelicals looking at sex trafficking as synonymous with human trafficking, and sex trafficking as, you said, bad as en su totalidad, totally bad.
Yes.
Versus feminist readings that are like, no, sex work should be dignified, should be legal,
sure.
all this. So the difference between sex as bad and consent and lack of freedom to enter into the industry or not.
Yes. Sure. No, I think that's, so I am beginning to know, I mean, so there was this book written by Alan Hertzke, a University of Oklahoma political scientist, who's written this very, very fascinating book on the very uneasy, sort of strange bedfellows between ACLU kind of activists and radical secular Jewish activists, who are feminists, and then evangelical Christians and Catholics working together on human trafficking. So I think there's a real kind of deep level of agreement that human trafficking, if it is really taking a person away from where she or he or they were and bringing them to a new place against their will and wish, and getting them to do things that they didn't want to do, that all of them agree that that should stop. But I think what has been interesting is that there's a scholar, Elizabeth Bernstein at Barnard, who's in women and gender studies and very strong radical feminist. And I've been in kind of, I really enjoyed reading her work a lot. And so I think my kind of questions for her have been, so in your understanding and there's a clear distinction, I think for a lot of the secular feminists and maybe some others as well. I mean, sex work in and of itself has some dignity if I choose in myself this particular path. And some evangelical Christians certainly don't see it that way. I think so. In her article, what she's talking about is sort of a very interesting politics of sexuality among these new abolitionists, namely a lot of these evangelical Christians. What does that really tell you about their commitment to, their understanding of human sexuality? Is it merely for procreation and enjoyment between spouses, or can you have allowance for sex work that is, so long as it doesn't destroy families, and so on and so forth? And it sounds like an inside baseball, but I think and I was quite surprised. But then when I thought about it, it made sense, right? I mean, because now it does, and I always ask this question, so what is your end goal? And when I interview people, like, so what would you like to see happen? And the answer is often very, very simple and profound, right? End this human slavery. But then my follow-up question of late has been, so do you think all kinds of sex work is slavery? And that to me has been a very, very fascinating. Now, I think, and that doesn't mean, by asking that, I don't mean to sidestep the bigger issue of human slavery that exists, and I think there's a lot of effort, and I would say that, to go back to Morgan's question too, there are a lot of kind of more progressive Christians also see this as a problem. I mean, so it's not that only conservative Christians are seeing that as a problem, but I have found that it's interesting because the historical context of a lot of conservative Christians in the U.S. and globally have been in many ways not that committed to social engagement, but that seems to have changed. But that change is also at a certain price point. There's a lot of, this guy, Dr. Bjorn, getting sacked from his position. That to me came as a surprise. He was really all about, his entire ministry, and I interviewed a lot of the associate pastors and interns, they're like, yes, the gospel is about eradication of human trafficking. And I asked one of them, like in private, like, did you always believe this? I was like, no, I came to this church and I was told that is what it is. And I said, do you believe it now? I was like, yes, of course. And so I don't mean to suggest any kind of brainwashing, but but it's a new way of thinking and being, right? Because this is something that we must do. So if the entire church's ministry and efforts is about eradication of human trafficking, and Dr. Ben has a much more substantial and sophisticated view on that than what I've just shared. I think he's really a kind of sophisticated thinker. But it did raise a lot of questions for their church to ask him to leave after all. And he started his own NGO, and then So I think there's really a complex narrative that is being told, and I didn't expect this. I thought it would be a very simple narrative of, aren't these evangelical Christians wonderful worldwide doing this work, and that's initially my naive intent. When I was just genuinely curious, because the individuals I met were really kind of wonderful heroes and heroines of the faith. But then as I'm finding out, I mean, that's true for any kind of family story, right? I mean, I realized after I was much older that my family has a very interesting history about this, that, and other. I didn't know when I was an 11-year-old boy. And so it's a kind of part of maturation process, I think. So, thank you. And by the way, I would love to hear more about what you all think about whether sex work in and of itself finds legitimate kind of calling. I mean, really, I mean, and if you can separate that from human trafficking, I mean, so legalization of, I mean, there are places in Vegas and Amsterdam, I mean, is that wrong? I mean, because according to their principality, they think that itself is a legal way of, and I'm not trying to be an agent provocateur, but it really does raise some questions. But Missy, go ahead, please.
So it sounds like that you looked at, there were a couple different models. Some people were just trying to restore the person to
Yes.
other types of work, and some were trying to overtly evangelize with relationship with Jesus being the end
Yes.
goal.
Yes.
Did you detect or find that one method more than the other was more effective in getting them out of trafficking?
No, not really. I mean, I'm you know, admittedly relatively small sample base right now, but no, I think it's not the efficacy of getting them out as much as the motivation, right? Or what does that mean to share the gospel, right? So after the tsunami, so the different kind of example, but there's a very well-known Sri Lankan Christian leader named Ajit Fernando, and he works with Youth for Christ. So after the tsunami happened, there are all these kind of care packages that came from all over the world, yes? And so a lot came to Youth for Christ, and their internal dilemma was this: do we sneak inside kind of undergarments and socks a gospel tract for spiritual laws or whatever? I mean, they had an intense debate about this, right? And then in the end, Dr. Fernando said, no, we're not going to put, you know, gospel tract inside, because that seems almost banal and cheap. I mean, what we are doing, rescuing people from their destitute and so on, in and of itself is doing the work of God and therefore the work of the gospel. But mind you, that came at, he says something like 52 to 48 kind of vote kind of thing. Very close, very kind of intensely renegotiating the boundaries of what is social action and what is the gospel, and aren't there boundaries to be much more blurred than what is in many people's kind of simple dichotomized view. So, thank you.
My question has to do with the fad or fixture
Yes,
portion.
yes.
And the idea that currently the debate or the dialogue around human trafficking is somewhat
Yes.
trendy.
Yes.
And how do we, as Christians and ethicists,
Yes.
sort of engage in that dialogue in a manner that's humanizing and respectful of the survivors and the victims? Do you have any advice or anything about how we actually do that, in recognizing that there are many people that don't. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think there are some wonderful local examples, Becca Stevens and the Thistle Farm, and that whole kind of enterprise is receiving a lot more national and international attention in terms of much more fuller-orbed kind of endeavor to restore the sense of, so it's not just getting you out of your kind of red light district or brothel, but to really restore the sense of wholeness to the extent that it is possible, right? And because I think, so another aspect is the work of the International Justice Mission has come under a lot of scrutiny recently, and especially so the magazine like The Nation, some of the writers are kind of, you know, offering some blistering rebuke of their kind of American cowboy style of rescue, but they also have changed. I think they became a lot more substantial and sophisticated. They really work a lot with the locals there. Yeah, so if you ask me, is that fad or fixture, it depends on which evangelical you ask. I think for Dr. Byun, it's a fixture. And for some others, it's a fad that a lot of evangelicals are trying to hitch their, horse to the wagon to a moving horse that would garner further respectability in the eyes of the world. I mean, these are some words that I've heard in my interviews. And I think that's the question, is it fad or fixture? If you ask me what I think, I always say I'm a historian. I'm not a. I think so fads sometimes become fixtures in certain people's minds. I mean, because you may just have come onto it because people are talking about this in the media all the time. It's like, oh yeah. And I think for this guy, Dr. Eddie Bjorn, I think that's how he came across and became a fixture for him. And I think, so it's going to be probably a little bit of both. I think for some churches, they will find some other things much more palatable and pressing. But for others, they will see this as a change of, and I've talked to a lot of these NGO workers whose lives have changed and whose callings have changed, their jobs have changed as a result of this fad that became fixture for them. So.
Would you say that the Christians are evangelicals a gatekeeper of this issue abroad, and is it keeping other organizations like governments and things from getting involved because it is such an emphasis about the Christian world right now? Does that make sense?
Yes. No. Yes. Yeah. 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 So I think with this kind of global human advocacy work, it's become a lot more complex than just only Christians do that. And so I think in the last two administrations, two presidents, so George W. Bush and Barack Obama, two very different figures. I think what is kind of consistent in both is that they both have become very kind of champions for and using the State Department and a lot of the US and UN funding that's available to get this at the forefront of and maintain it at the forefront of a lot of people's consciousness. So I think, yeah, this is a Christian lobbying effort that has had some genuinely interesting fruit, I would say. Because by saying good, I kind of give away my own kind of, because as a historian, I try not to kind of inject my own personal prejudice a lot. But it has been very interesting, because I thought in my stop when Barack Obama came into office, no, he's actually kind of continuing it on. And I think with ISIS as well right now, I mean, so there are many angles, and one angle that cannot be simply kind of, eliminated is that of religion, right? And so, so I do think that is something that is going to continue, I think, and it's not just a fad, at least from the standpoint of, so whoever the next president is, I think Senator Corker and numerous others are pressing, greater issue of, the global accountability. One question I have is, what is the role of the American government vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Are we the persons globally policing everyone's behavior and belief? And that's sort of the negative, more radical left's view is let them alone. But then as the neoliberal kind of engagement has complexified this narrative a lot. So, I'm finding it. So I'm in a new field of study. I'm just like a totally nerd, like geeking out in this field, and I haven't discarded my earlier phase of training at all. But I think it's just, I was just say this, maybe close with this comment. So I do believe that 17th century England, the Reformation world, is very important as a discourse of study, and also I would encourage students, I mean, there's a PhD student here coming from different school to work with me on this, and I do believe it's absolutely crucial. But this other thing has a lot more direct impulse and direct kind of, I don't want to say payoff, but so it kind of tugs away at my heart in a different way, if that makes sense, right? Because some of the writers, some of the people that I write about were incarcerated in 17th century for their beliefs, but this is a very different kind of ball of wax. So I find this work really life-giving and invigorating, but also tear-jerking and grief-generating at the same time. But I think worth the further inquiry. So, yeah, okay.
Mine is more like a comment.
Yes.
I was really struck by sexist work. I mean, I'm really naive. I've seen documentaries where prostitutes would say that that was a choice of them and that they felt empowered by doing that. So I've heard of it. And then I started to think about the basketball player, Khloe Kardashian's husband, who was in a brothel. And so that says in the United States, okay, we see sexist work because that is legal. That was a legal place. And I just wondered, is that just money making, or is evangelicals maybe a part of it? I just wonder, how did that all come about? Do you know if that's a part of
Evangelicals being part of it, meaning like part
like
of
the
going.
brothels. Yeah, because I mean that was my first.
Oh, you mean trying to stop that from existing and so on? You mean?
Are
or-
they? It's legal. So
Yes.
how did it become legal? And were evangelicals a part of supporting that, or is
Yeah,
that
no,
just about money making?
Right, right. No, since I don't know the answer to that actually. So in terms of how legalization of prostitution in Vegas or Nevada, certain parts of Nevada, did Christians have anything to do with it? I couldn't tell you. But I think in the Dutch Calvinist context, I think so the legalization of drugs and sex work wasn't done outside of Christian reflections about both these things. So as a common grace and how do we contain and curb evil with the eschatological hope and view that God, when God, in Jesus Christ returns, and God will wipe away all of our tears and eradicate death. So I don't know about the American answer, but I think the Dutch precedent might actually give some interesting things to think through. So, sure, thank you very much. Okay.